This is the first in a long series of videos making the case for populist conservatism. By that I mean the culture's moral values, social norms, and general idea of how to live the good life comes from ordinary people, not intellectuals. That makes it a bottom-up movement, because ideas bubble up organically from the bottom. In contrast, leftism and traditional conservatism are top-down movements, where intellectuals impose ideas on the rest of society and use their power over education and cultural institutions to do so. So now let's talk about the American and French revolutions. The reason why they're important is because the American Revolution was an essentially conservative revolution, and the French Revolution was the first truly leftist movement in history. And learning about these revolutions and the ideology that drove them is going to be a great introduction into the essence of conservatism and the essence of leftism. Let's start with the American Revolution. In 1776, the Founding Fathers gathered in Philadelphia, and Thomas Jefferson created one of the most brilliant and beautiful passages in human history when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute new government. The words are beautiful, but the ideas themselves came from the philosopher John Locke. He believed that God created a set of moral laws called the natural law, and since this natural law comes from God, it has a higher authority than any man-made law. Therefore, the proper role of government is to defend this natural law, and in particular, to secure and defend our natural rights. Our natural rights, according to Locke, are life, liberty, and property. Jefferson changed it to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think it was a rhetorical device because Jefferson was a beautiful writer. There's some debate that it was a subtle criticism of slavery. And there's other debate that some of the ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which was the turn against private property, were already creeping into political philosophy at this time. But I'm generally of the belief that it was a rhetorical flourish, and you shouldn't read too much into that. Now, John Locke was a philosopher of the Enlightenment, and we're going to talk about the Enlightenment quite a bit, so we need to get it down now. There's no agreed upon date for when the Enlightenment started, but there are three very good candidates. The first is in 1687, when Isaac Newton published his Principia Mathematica. The second is 1688, when the Glorious Revolution happened in England. That's when the old tyrannical King James II was bloodlessly driven out of power and replaced with the Glorious Revolution and the constitutional monarchy of William and Mary. And the third date is when Locke published his treatises on government outlining the natural law in 1689. The Enlightenment started out as a movement that was quite congenial to Christians. Isaac Newton was a devout Christian, John Locke was a professing Christian, but sometimes it seems like enlightenment is only half a word. It's really secular enlightenment. And as the Enlightenment progressed, it definitely got more and more secular. So that's another thing to keep in mind. The end date of the Enlightenment is also not widely agreed upon, but one of them is the French Revolution. And I personally love that idea because the first truly liberal movement in history was also the end of the Age of Reason. One more piece of historical information you need is that atheism was not yet very popular. You basically had devout Christians, such as the Puritans of Massachusetts, and you had secular deists. And deists are people who believe in God, but in an impersonal God who created the universe, but otherwise didn't have much to do with it after that. So they rejected the Trinity, they rejected the divinity of Christ. Thomas Jefferson is a good example of an Enlightenment deist. He actually went through the Gospels and cut out all the passages about Jesus that deal with miracles and just kept the parts where Jesus was helping the poor. So you see how deism has been influenced by Christianity even while it rejects a lot of Christianity's theological beliefs. What that means is that Enlightenment deists like Thomas Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration of Independence, could also affirm it. And so the Declaration of Independence really is America's unifying creed, or at least it was America's unifying creed. When we get to the French Revolution, we'll see that there was a rise of atheism, An atheist cannot affirm the Declaration of Independence. If you're an atheist, you've lost the idea of the natural law along with the idea of God. And so atheists find very different and more totalitarian basis for morality, which is exactly what we'll see when we turn to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, it is important to mention that Rousseau himself was not an atheist, he was a deist, but unlike Thomas Jefferson, he could not affirm the Declaration of Independence. Rousseau rejected that idea and that concept of natural law. Another final point to draw from this is that the left's rejection of the Declaration of Independence means that they have been ideological aggressors from the very beginning. The basis of the Declaration of Independence was used for all the great things that happened in America, such as the abolition of slavery, and the left has rejected it in order to create something far more radical. I personally would love it if secular intellectuals could reject atheism and return to Enlightenment deism, but I'm not going to hold my breath on that. The Enlightenment is associated with three main ideas: reason, science, and individual rights. Science we see in Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica. Science had been around for a long time before Newton, but there was something very special about Newton's Principia, the way he unified classical physics together. It was really a crown jewel up until Einstein. So science is embodied in Newton. Individual rights we see very clearly in John Locke, the right to life, liberty, and property, or pursuit of happiness if you prefer Jefferson's rhetorical take on it. And reason underlies, obviously, science, but it also underlies Locke's approach towards political philosophy and rights. So what Locke was doing was taking some distinctly Christian ideas and giving them a rational basis on the use of human reason. That would all change with the French Revolution. The French Revolution is a perfect parable for leftism in general. It began with some thoroughly and perfectly well-justified reasons, and yet somehow it got turned into a totalitarian nightmare, which ended with mass persecution and execution of political opponents during the Reign of Terror. So let's spend a little bit of time on the French Revolution to see how it got there and to see what the political ideologies driving it were. The French Revolution began with very modest and admirable goals. French peasants were forced to pay fees constantly everything they did. The comedian George Carlin has a bit about New Jersey being the toll booth state because he can't back his car out of the driveway without some schmuck in a cap wanting 50 cents. And that was pretty much the entire life of French peasants, except they had to pay a lot more than 50 cents. If they wanted to grind their own wheat, they had to pay a tax. If they wanted to bake their own bread, they had to pay a tax. If they wanted to press their own grapes to make wine, they had to pay a tax. And that's in addition to all the major taxes and fees on what they grew that they already owed their lord. Meanwhile, the French nobility were caught up in this high-status arms race of wealth, so that if you didn't have something like silver asparagus tongs or a jewel-encrusted snuff box, then you were just hopelessly impoverished and a nobody. So in the early stages, the French Revolution was about a reduction in these fees for peasants, and the nobility would have accepted them if they could have gotten political power like in England after the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution in England created a constitutional monarchy where the king did have to share power with Parliament, and that was what the nobility wanted. However, the French Revolution took on a very powerful internal momentum early on, and I'll give one example, which is the very famous storming of the Bastille. The Bastille prison had been a notorious prison in France where enemies of the crown had been arrested. So on July 14th of 1789, very, very early in the revolution's course, the French peasants all stormed the Bastille and took it down. And what was notable about it was, except for some very sporadic early resistance, the soldiers did not fight back. And that was one of the main problems that King Louis had, which was that the soldiers tended to be more loyal to the people than they were to the king himself. He was often criticized for being very passive, but he had a reason for his passivity. He couldn't really count on his own soldiers. The British politician Edmund Burke saw this momentum early on, and he had predicted that this revolution would get ugly, and he wrote his book, Reflections on the Revolution in France, where he predicted that the revolution would end in chaos, violence, and tyranny, and he was absolutely right. But it's important to realize that Burke was not some traditionalist conservative type. He was a member of the reform-oriented Whig Party in England, not the Tory party that supported the king. Burke had been a frequent critic of King George III, and Burke had defended the American colonists in their revolution against the crown. So people were actually shocked when Edmund Burke came out against the French Revolution. And the reason why he did so is really important to understanding conservatism. I think a lot of people on the left think that conservatism simply means support for existing hierarchies, but Burke's case was far more sophisticated than that. It's also worth remembering that this particular video series is about populist conservatism and not Edmund Burke's more elitist conservatism. But first, let's get a charitable take on Burke. Most people on the left have a deep love for nature, so I always use a nature analogy to explain to people on the left how conservatives see making radical changes. So here's an analogy. The California gold rush of 1849 is quite famous in American history, but there was also a less well-known fur rush. Sea otters in California, off the coast of California and throughout the North Pacific, were hunted for their fur because sea otter fur is extremely warm and extremely soft. So before people had modern synthetic fabrics, you wanted sea otter fur to stay warm and dry in the wintertime. So this hunting of sea otters had profound downstream consequences because sea otters are what biologists call a keystone species. Sea urchins are one of their primary food sources. So as the sea otter population declined, the sea urchin population exploded. The sea urchins eat kelp, so the kelp off the coast of California in the North Pacific was decimated. And the kelp forests are the food source for many, many diverse species. So by nearly hunting sea otters to extinction, they caused a huge ecological crisis off the coast of California. And that's exactly how conservatives see norms, traditions, and institutions. They exist in a very delicate ecosystem, and if you change one, you're going to get downstream consequences that are probably going to cause a lot of harm. A good way to get a handle on the French Revolution is to realize that it went through two stages, and each stage had its own leading philosopher. The early moderate stage was primarily influenced by a philosopher called Voltaire. Voltaire was one of the Enlightenment deists, and he very much worked in that tradition. He believed in the natural law, he believed in natural rights, and he was also a spirited and sharp-tongued critic of corruption in institutions, particularly the nobility and religion. And of those two, religion was really his main target, particularly the Catholic Church. One of his most famous quotes is, "I have never made but one prayer to God, a very short one. O Lord, make my enemies ridiculous." And God granted it. However, despite Voltaire's criticism of religion, his defining principle was his belief in religious tolerance. Voltaire was not a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed true believer, but he was an old cynic. And I think that gave him some wisdom, and he understood that if people who had power had the ability to choose people's religion, then that power would be corrupted. So for him, freedom of religion was really important. And because of that, freedom of religion was included in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen was basically the French version of the Bill of Rights. Unfortunately, it did not take long before the French Revolution's commitment to religious tolerance was tested. And this is one of the mistakes that the French Revolution made that goes back to Edmund Burke. If you think about sea otters and keystone species, one of the things that they did was they kept Catholicism as the official state religion, and that created a problem as the revolution grew more and more radical. In 1790, the revolutionary government passed the civil constitution of the clergy. Now that did a few things. One of them is they made all Catholic priests and bishops employees of the state. It also meant that priests and bishops were elected positions, elected by the people, including non-Catholics, rather than the Catholic Church determining their own leadership. But the most important was that they required all priests to swear an oath of allegiance to the French Constitution that transcended their own allegiance to their faith and to their pope. So because of this, about 40% of the priests refused to do this, and this set a long pattern of conflict between the Catholic Church and the French revolutionaries. It also turned John Locke's idea that natural law is higher than man-made law and turned it upside down, because now the allegiance to the government was higher than any allegiance to your faith. It's sea otters all the way down with the French Revolution. This conflict was widened as the revolution became more and more intent on replacing the king and forming a republic like in the United States. The simple fact was that many Catholics deeply loved their king. They wanted a reduction in all the crazy fees that peasants had to pay, and the Catholic nobility wanted a constitutional monarchy, but that was about as far as they wanted to go with the revolution. They did not want a republic. They did not want to get rid of their king. And that sets up a central problem that we still face today. What do you do if you believe that you're on the right side of history, but most of the population disagrees with you? Do you patiently set out to win hearts and minds, or do you shove your beliefs down the other person's throats? The French Revolution went with the second option, and that's when the influence of Voltaire gave way to the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Until the Enlightenment, most medieval and modern philosophers felt that human nature was naturally bad, a belief that came from the Christian doctrine of original sin. This negative vision of human nature had been eroding over the course of the Enlightenment, and John Locke himself was a bit squishy on it, but it took Rousseau to make the final break. He made his claim to fame when there was an essay contest about whether the Enlightenment had improved civilization, and in a flash of insight, he decided that the answer was no. This insight goes a lot deeper than just being a contrarian for the sake of winning an essay contest. And this idea that civilization is inherently bad is something that's deeply within the modern left today. Rousseau explains how it works with the parable of the noble savage. In an imagined history of primitive life, people live together in peace and harmony. They find all they need by hunting and by foraging, and the earth provided plenty of food and natural resources, so everyone was happy. There was no need to fight or wage war, and there was nothing to fight about. Rousseau rejected the Christian doctrine, but all philosophical systems need to have a concept of original sin, and Rousseau's was no different. For Rousseau, original sin was private property. The first time a man fenced in a piece of land and said, "This is mine," was when modern civilization and the downfall from these simpler, more peaceful and cooperative primitive times began. Once one person fenced in some land, then everyone else had to fence in their own land, and some people ended out with more land than others. Now, instead of the earth providing enough for everybody, some people had more than they needed and other people were starving. This led to conflict between individuals, but it also led to wars and conflicts between entire societies. Rousseau said it's too late to go back to those simpler primitive times, but we can recreate their spirit by creating a new social contract, a contract organized around what he called the general will. The general will is what's good for society as a whole. So under Locke, with private property, one person could fence in more land than he needed, and other people will starve because they don't have enough. But under Rousseau and the concept of the general will, we wouldn't necessarily have these fenced-in properties, and everybody would have enough. Now, Rousseau was not completely against all private property, but it's in Rousseau that we see this general trend of leftism of not respecting property rights anymore. Now, it's important to realize that Rousseau's parable of the noble savage is a myth. Modern anthropologists have known for quite some time that primitive societies are quite warlike and violent in comparison to modern life. Primitive societies fight for land, they fight for honor and glory, they fight for revenge, but most of all, they fight for women. So the idea that primitive societies are peaceful and get along, and that private property is some type of an original sin is simply wrong and mistaken. The anthropologist Lawrence Keeley drives this point home in his book War Before Civilization, which documents primitive warfare. And he points out that in typical primitive societies, the rate of people being killed in combat is about 20 times as high as the rate of Europeans killed during the 20th century, when both World War I and World War II occurred. But sometimes an anecdote drives home reality better than statistics. In this story about a Maori chief taunting the preserved head of a defeated enemy drives home the reality of primitive life. The chief said, "You wanted to run away, did you? But my war club overtook you, and after you were cooked, you made food for my mouth. And where is your father? He is cooked. And where is your brother? He is eaten. And where is your wife? There she sits, a wife for me. And where are your children? There they are, with loads on their back, carrying food, as my slaves. The anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon was another leading anthropologist bringing out the truth about primitive life, and he studied the Yanomama people in Brazil and Argentina. And he tells the story about how he almost got killed by them on the very first day that he met them. And it's not because they're so violent that they're going to kill any stranger on sight. In fact, they're generally quite friendly to strangers. But in the previous evening, members of a rival tribe had come in the middle of the night and abducted 7 women from the tribe. So the men went and chased after them, and they fought a brutal nighttime battle with clubs in the darkness, and they were able to get 2 of the women back, but the other men who left with the remaining 5 women threatened that they were going to come back the next day with bows and arrows and kill them all. And so that's why he almost got killed, as they had been awaiting this return raid in the daytime. So as we continue to discuss Rousseau, keep in mind that the founding principle of leftism is a myth that has no truth in reality. For Rousseau, if everyone submits to the general will, then you get 3 things: liberty, equality, and fraternity. And by fraternity, he meant a sense of community. Thus, Rousseau gave the French Revolution its famous slogan of liberté, égalité, and fraternité. And you still see this slogan in French documents and in public buildings and in French schools. Now, it's important to recognize what Rousseau did. There are no human rights under Rousseau's philosophy. There's only the general will. So what he did, compared to Locke, was that he redefined freedom as submission to the general will and what's good for society as a whole. And the dark side of that redefinition emerges when he discusses what to do with people who refuse to submit to the general will. In Rousseau's words, they should be forced to be free. Those 4 short words would be the cause of untold violence and untold misery for literally centuries running through the present day. Rousseau would be a major influence on every single leftist movement that would come after him. As I said, Rousseau himself was not opposed to all private property, but Marx and the communists would take the logical next step. The Black Book of Communism estimates that communism caused 100 million deaths during the 20th century. For example, Stalin sent 20 million people to the gulags, and Mao killed a lot more people in China. A lot of people like to say that fascism and Nazism are right-wing authoritarianism, and compared to communism, they absolutely are. But they are also the children of Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his leftist philosophy. The famous philosopher Bertrand Russell wrote in his History of Western Philosophy that, at the present time, Hitler is an outcome of Rousseau, Roosevelt and Churchill of Locke. The philosopher Paul Strathern, in his book Human 90 Minutes, writes this about Rousseau. Rousseau's ideas were to inspire both the glories and the excesses of the French Revolution and continued to play a similar role in the 20th century. His ideas are recognizable in both fascism and communism, as well as in the underlying drift towards self-expression and liberalism. World War II was basically people on Locke's side of history fighting against people on Rousseau's side of history, with the odd exception that we made an ally of convenience with the Soviet Union. But even before World War II had finished, we were already fighting the Soviets implicitly. For example, the United States declared war on Germany in December of 1941, but we didn't launch D-Day until about 3 years later in 1944. We did fight in Africa, but we didn't fight in Europe and open up a new front in Europe. And that's because we wanted the Soviets to bear the brunt of the costs of fighting the Germans. That would weaken the Soviets so that after the war ended, they would be in a weaker position relative to the United States. So we knew all along that they were our enemies. So again, World War II was the United States and Great Britain on the side of Locke, and really the rest of Europe and the Soviet Union on the side of Rousseau. The more you read about Rousseau, the more you see his ghost haunting modern leftism. To paraphrase, or butcher, John Maynard Keynes, modern leftists who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau did his work during the Enlightenment, but he was such a sharp break from that tradition that he's often considered to be the first philosopher of the Romantic Age, which began after the Enlightenment. If the Enlightenment was about reason, science, and individual rights, then the Romantic Age was about emotion, nature, and self-expression. When the conservative Ben Shapiro says, "The facts don't care about your feelings," he's invoking Enlightenment reason against romantic passions. the quasi-religious undertones of the modern environmental movement, which hold that our modern civilization is a plague against the goodness of the earth, is straight out of Rousseau in the Romantic period. And the idea that everyone is a unique and special snowflake fits right in with Rousseau's ideas on self-expression. However, before I leave Rousseau, I do want to talk about the good part of his philosophy. Rousseau's emphasis on nature wasn't just a rhetorical device. If you think about modern leftists, they all live in cities and yet venerate the countryside and nature. But Rousseau was really very much opposed to cities, and he felt that this dense urban living amplified the damages that modern civilization imposed on us. He talked about, and I'm going to butcher the French, amour propre. And the idea is that it's an old term for our modern status competitions. When you go into the city, you enter the status competition based on intelligence, based on having the right moral liberal beliefs. It also created a sense of status anxiety and insecurity because it's a race that you could never win. No matter how high you climb that totem pole, no matter how far ahead in the rat race you are, this status competition is ultimately going to consume you. What Rousseau wanted was people to live simple and authentic lives of real pleasures and not play these sort of status competition games. So I find it ironic that modern leftists have abandoned the best part of Rousseau, namely his criticism of how urban city living enhances status competitions. And yet, they've kept the worst parts of Rousseau, namely his authoritarianism and his idea that freedom is now redefined to be submission to the general will. By contrast, conservatives have kept the spirit of Rousseau. They've rejected his ideas and his redefinition of freedom, but they've kept the idea of living an authentic life divorced from status competitions. And this is exactly what you see in the debates about flyover country versus coastal elites. So people on the coast tend to sneer at the rubes and flyover country who would promptly fall right to the bottom of their status competitions because they don't have the intelligence or the education to keep up. And then people in the central areas, the flyover country, sort of reverse that snobbery back to the coastal elites. And sometimes in their more sincere moments, people in the coastal elites wonder why cities are somehow so much worse than living in the countryside. And Rousseau tells us exactly why. Living in the cities is to enter the world of status competitions, but living in the countryside, living in small towns, you live these authentic lives built around social connection rather than social status. Life in a small town is about enjoying the company of the people in your lives, your family, and your community. So now that we understand Rousseau and the general will, let's return to the French Revolution. The conflict between the Catholic Church and the Revolution kept escalating, particularly after King Louis was put on trial for treason and executed. And, in fairness, King Louis really was committing treason. His letters revealed that he'd been playing a double game. He praised the revolution publicly, and in secret he was writing letters to other monarchs asking them to come invade and put an end to the revolution. So the revolution began a process known as de-Christianization. They made it illegal to practice Catholicism. Catholic priests could not give communion, they couldn't baptize babies, and so on. Many priests refused to comply and continued offering underground masses in secret, and they were one of the main groups of people sent to the guillotine during the Reign of Terror. Meanwhile, the French revolutionaries were auctioning off church property. This is actually a common trend that happened widely throughout history. It happened in Germany and in England after they went Protestant, which is that rulers who were no longer Catholic realized they could make a lot of money by auctioning off church property, and the French were no exception. But it was also quite cruel, particularly for some of the elderly nuns. Young women could maybe remarry or go back into society, but the old women had no place to go, and the pension system was very sporadic, so many elderly nuns were just left homeless and starving on the streets. One of the weird things about the left is they're very pacifist when they're out of power, but when they get power, they're actually very militaristic, and the French Revolution set this stage. During the revolution, they began to wage war against some of the monarchies that surrounded them. They wanted to spread democracy, and they also had a wag the dog type motive where they thought that war would help unify the French people and distract them from domestic problems. And with war came conscription, and conscription was the last straw for many Catholics. They could either send their sons to die for a revolution that was actively oppressing them, or they could fight back. And so many chose to fight back, particularly in the Vendée region of France. The war in the Vendée was extremely brutal, although in fairness to the French revolutionaries, all wars back then were brutal. The main tactic was to starve the local population into submission, so they would destroy crops and destroy livestock and often target civilians. This was before the Geneva Conventions, although even in our modern wars like World War I, you had the Germans trying to starve the British and the British trying to starve the Germans, so things haven't necessarily changed that much since then. The most notable atrocity from the war at the Vendée was the drowning at Nantes. And there, the desire to kill captive counter-revolutionaries more efficiently led to them loading thousands of them, including women and children, onto barges and then sinking them. This happened repeatedly over a period of time. Estimates vary, but thousands of people were killed this way. One of the most important but underappreciated events in the French Revolution was the insurrection of May 31 to June 2nd. The French people had been getting more and more radical, but the moderate Girondin party had all the power in the National Convention. So what happened during this time is that armed French peasants stormed the National Convention, along with members of the Paris Commune and the Paris National Guard. Now, the Paris Commune was the city government of Paris, and Paris was always more radical than the rest of the French countryside. So the Paris Commune and the Paris National Guard were particularly radical. And these people forced the National Convention to arrest and then later execute the moderate members of the Girondin party. This gave the radical Jacobins all the power in the National Convention and directly paved the way to the Reign of Terror. We don't know exactly how many people died in the Reign of Terror, but it was about 40,000 political prisoners executed. About half of them were executed by the guillotine, the other half in firing squads or the drownings at Nantes, and some of them just starved to death or died of disease in prison before they could be charged and executed formally. After the Reign of Terror ended, the French tried to form a more moderate government, but it wasn't very stable, so Napoleon stepped in and became dictator. And the French Revolution and Jean-Jacques Rousseau was discredited for quite some time. However, a few important things happened in the second half of the 1800s that made Jean-Jacques Rousseau relevant again. The first was Charles Darwin, who made atheism more intellectually respectable. There was a wave of atheism leading up to the French Revolution, but it really took Darwin to make atheism as powerful as it is today. The second thing that happened was Karl Marx, and he leaned on Darwinism essentially to create his prophecy that capitalism would give way to communism. And there's a reason why he felt this. The Industrial Revolution was under full swing during the 1800s, and it was not a good thing for workers. It took a long time before workers were actually better off. There's a big economic debate in the economics literature about what point in time workers were finally better off, but there's no debate that it initially made workers worse off. And one part about Karl Marx's most famous work, Capital, that is so good is he documented just how horrific the conditions for English textile workers were. Marx also benefited from Darwin in the sense that there was a progression through history leading towards a final evolved form. So Marx had his prophecy that the world would eventually become communist and we would live in this utopian society. And it would have been hard to do that without that metaphor of Darwin's philosophy to drive it. And the irony is that Jean-Jacques Rousseau was reinvigorated by both Darwin and Marx, and yet they both made the world much worse places. Darwin was the first of the social Darwinists. You sometimes hear people say that Darwin's words were twisted into social Darwinism, but that's simply not true. You can look this up on the Gutenberg Project online. In The Descent of Man, Darwin writes, "At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races." So Darwin is predicting a global genocide, like Hitler was timid in comparison to what Darwin was predicting would happen. And of course, Marx himself gave us communism, and the Black Book of Communism estimates 100 million deaths. About 20 million were killed when Stalin sent them to the gulags, and 60 million were killed during Mao's Great Leap Forwards in China. Pol Pot was responsible for another 2 million. You add them all up, you get about 100 million. You can quibble with the numbers a little bit, but ballpark that estimate is about right. So the resurgence of leftism has come, but it's only brought us horrors. One of the most important conservative lessons is that ideas have consequences. And we see that very clearly with the rise of atheism. If you're an atheist, then you pretty much have to reject the idea of individual rights. You have to reject the idea that there's an inherent spark of dignity inside each individual human being. Instead, you need to look for something that can be measured scientifically or determined scientifically rather than this mythical human right. So atheists are pretty much locked into Rousseau's concept of the general will. However, there's another more psychological reason why modern secular intellectuals are drawn towards Rousseau and the general will. And that's that there just isn't much for intellectuals to do under a Lockean paradigm. If you believe in individual rights, and if you believe that the natural law is higher than any man-made law, then you don't get to be a philosopher king who rules over civilization. The general will gives atheists a lot more power because someone has to determine what the general will is. In Rousseau's vision, during the time of the noble savage, people knew instinctively what the general will was. But Rousseau realized that modern times are much more complex, and it required someone with moral and intellectual authority to determine and interpret the general will. He called these people legislators, and he gives a couple examples from history. One is Moses, who led the Israelites, and another is Lycurgus, who set up that military system in Sparta. The idea is that societies need someone with wisdom to act as a lawgiver. Under Locke, the lawgiver is God himself. Under Rousseau, a human being gets to play the role of a lawgiver. And that's very appealing to modern atheists. It will come out over the course of this video series that I have a love-hate relationship with postmodernism. On one hand, it's very intellectually dishonest, and it gives rise to a lot of fuzzy-headed reasoning, but on the other hand, it does a great job of exposing our inner hypocrisies and our quest for power. A good postmodernist would say to atheists who keep the general will, what is your motive? What is your real motive for this revolution that you want to lead? Are you really motivated by your love of the oppressed, or do you want power for yourself? There's that old observation that liberals don't really like people except in the abstract, and the idea is that they have these strong commitment to justice, even though they're not actually very social and they don't actually like people very much. But I think the postmodernist challenge reveals the lie at this observation, which is that a lot of atheists and a lot of liberals don't really like people and they don't really care about the oppressed, but what they do want is power.